From the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., this is Rendezvous with History, a podcast that captures the drama of presidential decision-making. Dr. Anthony Eames sits down with prominent scholars and leading citizens to bring to life what happens in the White House and how it shapes the world.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
Welcome back, Rendezvous with History listeners. As always, I'm your host, Anthony Eames, and I'm pleased to be joined here today with Robert Merry, New York Times bestselling author, 40-year veteran of the Washington journalism scene, including stints as the Wall Street Journal Washington correspondent and the CEO of Congressional Quarterly, but perhaps more importantly for our purposes today, the author of William McKinley, or President McKinley, Architect of the American Century. Robert, thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, Robert, it seems like every president at one point or another has their moment in the sun yet again. And President McKinley is, of course, getting more interest from a popular audience, from the American public, and from people who want to maybe know a little bit about how President Donald Trump's mind ticks. President Trump has recently declared that McKinley is one of his favorites. So we want to dig into why might McKinley be one of Donald Trump's favorite presidents, and I think we're going to start from the beginning with McKinley. You've set up an interesting conversation about William McKinley. Was he an agent of change and progress at the turn of the century, leading into the American century, or was he merely really just a plotting figurehead, oversetting this kind of inevitable march forward for America? How do you see that?
Well, you're right that McKinley is having his day in the sun. He had to wait only 123 years for that, but there it is. Worth the wait, I'm sure, for the former president. Well, McKinley was, I describe him as being a kind of a mysterious figure. I talk about the mystery of William McKinley, and the mystery is, how did he get so much accomplished when so many people underestimated him and felt that he was a man who wasn't really affecting events, but was actually being kind of buffeted by events? I make the case in my book, which came out in 2017, that yes, indeed, he was a man of mark, but he shrouded that ability to manipulate events. He was very good at it by moving things from the shadows and from the background and not caring about who got the credit as long as he got what he wanted. One of his war secretary said that he always got his way because he never cared who took the credit. So there was a kind of a thesis, which I called the leaf in the wind thesis, which was that he was kind of a leaf in the wind, buffeted by the gusts that would come up and move him one way or another way, and he wasn't actually affecting the wind. But I don't believe that about McKinley. I think he was, in fact, a man of mark and deserves a higher place in his standing in the presidential arena than he gets.
You know, it's interesting. It's not an uncommon characterization of 19th century presidents as being of middling talent and yet somehow supremely effective. Not to say that McKinley was of middling talent, but certainly that seemed to be a criticism of his throughout his political career. But to jump back before his political career, the forge of war, as you say, clearly his service in the Civil War has an impact on him. Not surprising, has an impact on quite a few people. But show me, demonstrate for us how that service changed him, how it changed his ambitions, his plans, his relationships to powerful people. Someone like Rutherford B. Hayes, for example.
Well, McKinley was transformed by the war. It gave him a lot of confidence and a sense of who he was. He was a heroic figure. He entered the military, the Army, U.S. Army, as an 18-year-old private. He ended the war as a brevet major And he always said that he felt that that was one of his greatest claims to fame, that he rose through the ranks in significant measure because he was a great protege of Rutherford B. Hayes, who became president in the same year that he became a member of Congress. And he received many of his promotions as a result of great daring do and heroic action. The famous episode in the early one, he was a quartermaster in the Battle of Antietam, which, as you know, was the bloodiest battle in terms of deaths in American military history. And his unit that he was assigned to, he was a quartermaster, so he was behind the lines, had fallen and sort of gotten trapped and was trapped all day and not having had any breakfast. Now it's late afternoon, and these people are really starving. Not literally starving, but they're desperately hungry and weak. So he loads up a wagon and goes through the forest on the way to the front. One general sees him and tells him to go back. There's no way to possibly get that food to the troops. But he ignores that order and does it, and basically saves that unit. And from that, he became an officer, a lieutenant, and moved up from there. So the war really gave him a sense of who he was. And I think that his relationship with Hayes cemented that sense of himself that he carried with him through his life.
What are the ways in which Hayes seeks to bestow favor or mentor McKinley in his early political days?
Well, he fostered these promotions, and Hayes himself was wounded 3 times during the war, so he was a bit of a heroic figure himself. But Hayes became a real father figure to McKinley and guided him and gave him a lot of counsel. In fact, he once, when McKinley indicated that he wanted to follow into Hayes's footsteps and go into politics and run for Congress, Hayes kind of attempted to nudge him away from that on the theory that he could make a lot more money if he went to work for a railroad company in those days after he was a lawyer. But he treasured up the letter that Hayes sent to him suggesting as much, but he rejected the advice and ran for politics despite what Hayes had suggested.
Well, sometimes it's good to listen to your mentors, and sometimes it's good to thank them for their advice and keep going in the direction that you plan to go in, I suppose. You know, Hayes and McKinley, they exist in this kind of rough and tumble world of, late 19th century Ohio politics. And you paint the picture, it's a state that's undergoing a dramatic transformation from an agricultural economy to kind of the epicenter of a new industrial age with access to water routes and transportation and energy in the form of coal deposits and huge swaths of immigrant groups from Europe, specifically Germany, creating a kind of surplus in labor that could meet the demands of industrialization. And all the while, there's relative parity between Republicans and Democrats. So how does McKinley navigate this incredibly dynamic world of Ohio politics to rise to the top of it?
Well, here's where I think I've got to give a little bit of a description to how McKinley operated. I've hinted at it. McKinley was not a visionary in the mold of Teddy Roosevelt or Captain Mahan of the Navy, who was the great exponent of naval power, sea power. But he was a man. He had a managerial turn of mind. He had a very absorbent mind and an ability to absorb information and process it and find opportunity where it existed as a result of unfolding events. He didn't attempt to necessarily make those events unfold, but he shaped and molded his strategies as a result of what he saw in terms of opportunities, or I suppose also political dangers. And so he emerged as and he also was a fine human being. one historian of the period, Warren Zimmerman, says he's probably the nicest man who ever became president. And I think there may be some truth to that. But in any event, he brought those traits to his political career, and they served him very, very well. He was a thoroughgoing Republican, and Republican Party pretty much dominated. But as you say, the state kind of rested on a knife's edge of parity between the parties. So you didn't have a lot of leeway in terms of moving forward as a Republican or a Democrat. You had to find some voters from the other party along the way. And McKinley had a knack for doing that. So he emerged with those traits in Ohio politics, and he emerged in Washington as a bit of a player. He became chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, ran for speaker at one point, and lost that job. But he became chairman of Ways and Means, from which he was able to press his number one priority issue, and that was tariff rates and protectionism.
Let's get into that. I mean, it's, protectionism, while in Congress, protectionism, again, is yet again a hot topic. It seems to be coming into the policy of the day here in 2025, as it was in, say, 1885, when McKinley was in Congress. What's shaping his view of the need for high tariffs, for a protectionist economy?
Well, I think tradition, for one thing, and history. The Federalist Party, a very early republic, was a high tariff party. Alexander Hamilton believed in tariffs, although he suggested that they could go away in terms of the protectionist heights of the tariff after the industrial machines were getting established on the continent. But the Whig Party, the succeeding Whig Party, led and pretty much founded by Henry Clay, was also a high tariff protectionist party, and the Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln. Tariffs were a part of this, all related tariffs. I've got to back up here and suggest that there was no income tax in those days, so the tariffs were the primary source of revenue for the government. So there were going to be tariffs. The question was, would they be so high and would they be targeted for protectionist purposes? And the Democrats were the party of free trade, the party of strict construction of the Constitution, the party of small government. And they didn't want those high tariffs. But the other parties that I just enumerated did. So that was the tradition that McKinley inherited. But then, as you point out very, very eloquently, there's an explosion of industrial development going on in America, and much of it was taking place in Ohio. And so it was natural that McKinley and almost all of his Republican colleagues would embrace protectionist tariffs as a means of ensuring that this industrial explosion that was taking place would continue and grow.
So McKinley kind of makes his name in Congress, and perhaps more generally with the American people, as being this affable, polite politician who has a belief in a high tariff economy, a protectionist worldview. And he takes us into the 1896 election. And he takes us into the 1896 election initially as a kind of presumptive favorite, it seems, but then runs into the source of conflict with party bosses, and then into in the primaries, and then into or pre-convention, and then into a really gifted orator in the general, William Jennings Bryan. So again, a man of supposedly middling gifts and lacking in charisma, runs this incredible campaign in 1896. And how do you see that campaign kind of developing over the course of its lifetime?
Let me begin with how he was going to get the nomination. And how he thought he was going to get the nomination was by pulling together the big party bosses that sort of ran things in terms of Republican politics in New York and Pennsylvania and New England and other places in the East. So he sends his top advisor, Mark Hanna, to the East to talk to these bosses. And he comes back and meets with McKinley with a few other stalwarts at Hanna's big lakefront place in Cleveland. And after dinner, they go into his study and they light up the cigars and pour the brandy. And Hanna is all excited because he says, "Now, Governor, it's all over, but the shouting. They'll all support you, but they have some conditions." "What are the conditions?" asked McKinley. "Well, they want the patronage from New York and Pennsylvania, of course, and New England and here and there, and they want the Treasury Secretary to be handed to the New York boss." McKinley gets up, takes a couple of puffs on his cigar, walks around the room a little bit, and says, "Mark, if that's the price I have to pay, it's not worth it to me, and it's not worth it to the American people. So I'm out of it." "Oh, hold on there, Governor," says Hanna. "All I said is it could be sewn up, but you can beat these guys." Well, the bosses combined to beat McKinley, and they had a lot of juice, but they lost in the primary battle. And that was a typical example of how McKinley outmaneuvered adversaries that seemed to be better positioned than he himself for winning the prize. But he did get the nomination, and it was a pretty easy convention. And so then, as you point out, he had to encounter the prairie populist, William Jennings Bryan, who was the not only probably among the leading populists of our history, but also certainly among the leading orators of our history. And he had a big issue because the country was just barely coming out of the panic of 1893, which was a devastating economic dislocation and contraction. So Hanna had the essentially near depression to run against and blame the Republicans, although it was under the Cleveland administration and Cleveland was a Democrat. So William Jennings Bryan had the depression at his back, and he came out and pushed very strongly for what was called the free coinage of silver. He wanted to expand the money supply because the constriction of money supply was retarding economic development. So he wanted silver to be added to gold as a basis of a currency. And he had a good issue, but McKinley managed to outmaneuver him as well. McKinley really wanted to run based on his protectionist principles, but William Jennings Bryan made that impossible because he was running so hard on the free coinage of silver that McKinley had to decide how he was going to run, how he was going to play that. And he went up against him four square and stayed with the gold standard as the basis for currency stability in America as it came out of that recession.
So let's get into his presidency. I mean, he is a president, as you note, had witnessed the continual decline of presidential powers the preceding 20 years vis-a-vis Congress, and he comes into office with an intention to strengthen that presidency. And what happens during his time in office is the territorial expansion of the United States. And that's certainly the thing that I think most Americans think of, if they do think of McKinley at all. How did this territorial expansion into the Caribbean and the Pacific shape presidential power? How did it shape McKinley's view of the office? And how did it allow him to kind of, execute against his goals, his plans to expand presidential power?
Well, McKinley's been called the first modern president because he expanded the concept. Everyone knew that the presidency was a part and parcel of the electorate. He's the only man who's elected by all the voters, all the American people, and accountable to all the American people every 4 years. And McKinley really sort of pressed that concept by going out and speaking much more avidly and much more widely than his predecessors had. He formulated a very strong relationship with the news media, with the newspaper reporters, and created a press office in the White House, which had never been before. So he understood how to leverage his ability to use what TR later called the bully pulpit to talk to the American people through the news media and directly and travel around the country extensively. But he also was not always out front of where the American people were. He was always prepared to jump out there and get ahead of where things were going. But he was not the kind of guy who was going to come up with a great visionary plan and press for it avidly or strongly. Rather, I'll give you a good example. Rather, he held back until he could see where things were going, and then he pounced. So he was elected at a time when Cuba was in turmoil, and Spain was in turmoil because Cuba was part of the Spanish Empire. And there was a tremendous uprising, a tremendous rebellion against Spanish rule in Cuba. And it was destabilizing the entire Caribbean because it was affecting trade, it was affecting all kinds of other things in terms of the stability of the region. And there was a lot of agitation, coming from Congress and coming from organizations, and there was a lot of sentiment in America to go down there and do something about it, sort of stop that war. But McKinley held back, and people thought that he was afraid or maybe timid. But in fact, from the shadows and from the back rooms, he quietly was letting Spain know that the status quo, the ongoing difficulties and turmoil, could not continue in the region. And the Spanish Queen Regent, who was running Spain, preparatory to her son reaching majority, she pushed back and she said, "You can't. It's none of your business. You're not in a position to tell us what we should do." But there was a lot of angst and anguish in America about how brutal the Spanish were in trying to put down that rebellion, and also how helpless they seemed to be in affecting that goal. So McKinley makes it clear that he's not going to back down, and that leads to quiet frictions between the president and the government of Spain. Then, of course, McKinley sends the battleship Maine into Havana Harbor to help protect Americans in this situation, should that be necessary, and it gets blown up. No reason to believe it was done purposely by any party at issue here, but nevertheless, it was blown up, and that made war pretty much inevitable. And so the question then becomes, how did he perceive that war? Well, he perceived it in terms of a little note that he wrote to himself and kept in his pocket through the war, which was not a long war, 3 to 4 months. And what the note said was, during hostilities, we must keep all that we get. After the war is over, we must keep all that we want. And we basically kept everything that we wanted, that we got, except for Cuba, which we had promised in a resolution in Congress prior to the war's beginning, that if we got into hostility with Spain, we wouldn't attempt to acquire Cuba as a kind of the spoils of war. Well, we got the Philippines, we got Guam, we got Puerto Rico, and we destroyed Spain as a global empire, and we supplanted Spain as an American empire.
So you talk about McKinley as the first modern president for his role in dealing with the press, specifically vis-a-vis issues of wartime that bring about American empire, overseas empire, that is, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific. And of course, that sets the stage for presidential power in the 21st century, the way in which we engage the world. But perhaps more importantly, in the long term, is his administration's initiatives to open the door to China and to open the door to Chinese trade and reciprocal trade in China. How does that play against the protectionist instincts that McKinley had had throughout his political career?
Well, I think that he had already was beginning to take a different view of tariffs and protectionism and trade during his presidency. McKinley perceived something that was not very hard to perceive, but a lot of people kind of missed the implications of it, which was that America was expanding so fast economically, and the industrial capacity of America was growing to such an extent that we were producing far more goods, both agricultural and industrial, than this market, this domestic market, could absorb because it wasn't big enough. And therefore, he knew that we were going to have to move overseas to find overseas markets for American products. And he conceived this. It actually was James G. Blaine's idea, but he took it and then refined it, and he called it reciprocity. And the idea was to move towards bilateral agreements with other countries in which we would reduce our tariffs if they would reduce their tariffs and other trade barriers. And he was pushing for that reciprocity concept. He got some encouragement from Congress, and some resolutions were passed. He got some legislation passed that gave him a kind of a by your leave to move in that direction. And he did so. And he went to Buffalo, New York at the Great Exposition there, essentially a World's Fair, to give a speech in which he eloquently explained the significance of this reciprocity concept. And he used language that was very much like the free trade language that was being used by Democrats at the time. So it was a major turnaround in terms of his philosophy. And the day after he gave that speech, he was shot, and 8 days later he died. So he wasn't able to press that thing as hard as he would have, and he would have pressed it very, very hard. But you were asking also about the open door policy in China. So let me talk about that a little bit. China was being carved up by the industrial powers, mostly European powers and Japan. And it was being essentially carved up to such an extent that it wasn't clear it was going to be able to survive as a nation. America now was in Asia. We got Hawaii, and also in 1898, same year as the Spanish-American War, through annexation. And Hawaii, we must recognize, is one of the major strategic points upon the entire globe, because there's no other place nearby in the North Pacific from which you could project power or prevent any other nation from projecting power against you. So getting Hawaii was hugely significant. And then getting the Philippines was also significant. So the Americans, under McKinley and his very brilliant Secretary of State, John Hay, crafted this open door policy, and in which it's basically said, and the other European powers didn't like it, but they didn't have much choice but to go along with it for moral as well as strategic reasons. But the idea was that, number one, all countries should be equal in terms of their ability to ply trade within China. And number two, that this carve up had to stop, that the open door policy implied that these industrial powers were not going to continue to take port cities and other strategic locations in China in the sort of colonial era. So he also crafted then what I called non-colonial imperialism. We weren't looking, we picked up, as I mentioned, these other entities, Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines, but we weren't, that wasn't our aim. That was a sort of a serendipitous result of the Spanish-American War. And the concept of exercising soft power to increase your influence, your global influence, kind of emerged with McKinley, not totally articulated in great detail, but nevertheless, it sort of emerged as a new reality.
As we've discussed earlier, McKinley is once again having his moment in the sun. And I suppose the question that a lot of listeners would like to know is, does Donald Trump have his memory of McKinley correct? Is he taking inspiration from the right version of McKinley, the kind of true version of McKinley? Or is he taking inspiration from a McKinley that has been kind of reimagined for today's purposes?
Well, I would say the answer to that is not an answer that I like to use very often, but yes and no. I think it's clear that Trump understands McKinley in terms of the two things that he really cares about. Number one, tariffs and protectionist tariffs. And that was McKinley. Of course, I think he kind of ignores the later conversion, which is rather significant, but nevertheless, you can see how Trump would perk up and become somewhat beguiled by McKinley's history as a protectionist. And the other big aim, it seems to me, in terms of Trump is territorial expansionism of a kind that we haven't seen for a long, long time in terms of what Trump seems to be talking about, but which was natural and a significant part of the McKinley legacy. So it's not unnatural or surprising, particularly, that Trump would sort of perk up when I think he developed his views about protectionism and expansionism prior to his understanding or his embrace of McKinley, but you can see why he did. On the other hand, 2025 is not 1898, and the world today and the economy of the major countries, especially the major economic countries, are very much different from they were in the days of McKinley. And so I don't know that McKinley's serves as a very good model for the tariff question. As noted by the Wall Street Journal today, I think the full amount of imports to America amounts to about $3 trillion in change, whereas the tax base on the income tax is 25 trillion and change. So that 3 trillion and change is not enough to extract enough tariff revenue to run a government like ours. And Trump is not talking in a way that indicates that he sort of has perceived that. And as for the expansionist, as I say, the world is a lot different today than it was then. And we'll see how this goes. But some of the bullying tactics would be anathema, certainly to McKinley, and pretty much anathema to diplomacy generally in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Well, Robert, thanks again for joining us on today's show of Rendezvous with History and bringing us up to speed on all things McKinley. Once again, if you want to learn more, pick up Robert's book on President McKinley, Architect of the American century. Thanks again for joining us on the show today, Robert.
My pleasure, Anthony. Thank you very much.
Rendezvous with History is a podcast produced by the Ronald Reagan Institute's Scholarly Initiatives. You can learn more at ronaldreaganinstitute.org and follow along on social media at Reagan Institute.